Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give it just a couple of seconds for the participants to enter the room. I think we're getting there a little bit. Awesome. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our October Transfer and Articulation Community of Practice Forum. My name is Dr. Mark Booker. I'm the Vice Provost of Strategy at University of Phoenix. I'm also the chair of our Transfer and Articulation Committee. And so I'm really excited today because our guest speaker is Mark McConaughey, also known as the other McConaughey in regards to Matthew McConaughey. So we're really excited to have him here with us. Mark is a consultant, also a lead individual in AACRAO in regards to micro-credentials and alternative credential strategy. He's been a part of the AACRAO community for a very long time, was one of the, I believe, original individuals that started up the Tech and Transfer Conference, as it was known back in the day. Now it's the Transfer Summit post COVID, or has different names, but he was instrumental in that, and has been part of our group as AACRAO for a long time, and has moved on into the exciting world of alternative and micro credentials. And so I'm going to turn the floor over to him in a moment for him to give us some information around that and how it impacts also the transfer community. But just wanted to put a plug for AACRAO and why we're here and what we do. So the AACRAO Transfer and Articulation Community of Practice meetings are an extension of the Transfer and Articulation Committee for AACRAO. We are a professional activities committee that helps set the program for AACRAO's annual meeting, which will be coming up early next year, I believe in April. But one of the things that we've done is we've decided to create calls every other month for participants to learn more about topics around items that are germane to transfer, articulation, credit for prior learning, etc. And these topics actually are sourced from you as the community. So post this meeting, if you have any ideas on future topics, please feel free to reach out to me and we'll talk about it with the committee and decide our next topic. So we do have some other topics already slated in the future, some around credit for prior learning. Another topic we're going to be looking at is just the different systems and tools that we use on campuses to do transfer credit eval. But again, today we're here for alternative and micro credentials. And this is also a shared space. So Mark will go through his presentation, but it's a shared space to ask questions. And so we'll leave plenty of time for questions that you may have for him or anyone else who's joined us on the call. And we have about 50 almost individuals from the community on the call. So it's a great turnout today and appreciate you all being here. So without further ado, because you didn't come here just to hear from me, or you didn't come here to hear from me at all, I'm going to give it to Mark McConaughey, and he'll take the floor to share his information about alternative and micro credentials. So Mark, the floor is yours. Oh, before I do that, sorry. If you have questions in the chat, feel free to put them in the chat. I will help moderate the chat with Mark as he's presenting, and we'll go from there. And then at the end, we will also take questions on the fly. But I know Mark, as he presents, really also likes real-time questions. So don't be shy if you have a real-time question that you want to put in the chat, and I'll ping him on that to let him know we have something. So now, Mark, take it away.
Okay. Now, if you could go ahead and let me share the screen. Do that. And give me a nod of the head if you're seeing my AACRAO slide. Very good. Well, here you are on a Friday afternoon. I have to give it up for all of you who are willing to come listen to me on a Friday afternoon when no doubt you're looking forward to something either this Friday evening or over the weekend. So let me give it up for you. I am Mark McConaughey. My title is the Digital Credentials Coordinator for AACRAO. Before that, I worked at Indiana University in the registrar's office for almost 40 years. In the last 13 of those years or so, I was the registrar and associate vice provost. Reporting to me was the financial aid, the one-stop shop, our tech group, the institutional research group, and all of those things that basically supported enrollment management. So I have some experience associated with both this, and I guess I should say near the end of my tenure there, in the last 4 or 5 years, a little bit before COVID, we embarked upon an initiative to basically put up what we called an e-notation, but in essence, it is what we call now a comprehensive learner record. It wasn't associated with the transcript. It represented other types of awards that Indiana wanted to acknowledge, that wanted to assert on behalf of their students, but wasn't necessarily a good fit for the traditional transcript. So that's part of why I became associated with this initiative at AACRAO. The other one was, as Mark pointed out, although I wasn't the principal initiator of the Tech and Transfer Conference, or of the Technology Conference as it was known, I did direct it for about 8 years. And it was Technology Conference when I started, then it became Tech and Transfer in about 2012, 2013. In 2015, one of the tracks that we had at Tech and Transfer Conference was called the Extended Transcript. And what it was the idea that, you know what, we are sitting on academic records and academic information, and yet we have asserted for the benefit of our students the exact same thing that we were asserting basically back in the late 1800s. And so the whole idea behind that was, well, couldn't we do better? Not only that, there was a rise at the time with trying to acknowledge the kinds of learning that was happening outside the classroom, what was happening in the co-curricular space. And so there was sort of a parallel push in other areas beyond AACRAO for a transcript that represented those kinds of things. And to make a long story short, because you don't want to listen to me all afternoon, these kind of initiatives sort of came together. Initially, it was called the Extended Transcript. It became the ILR, then the CLR. And as we'll explain as we go through some of these slides, it sort of expanded beyond AACRAO truly into the learner and employment record. Same concept, same idea, but you'll see how it all fits together. Well, you know, I did retire from Indiana University and gosh, after 40 years, and you know, it's been kind of a rough transition, and gosh, I kind of became addicted to well, I had some addictions I had to come deal with, and I'm just so thankful for family and friends and my professional colleagues at AACRAO. Turns out I was addicted to soap, but I'm clean now. You know, I can't, in these, I truly recognize that a joke like that will not elicit a lot of laughter. Nevertheless, I love those kinds of jokes. Anyway, if you've ever seen me present before, you also know that I often discuss myself as the Brad Pitt of registrars. I think it's obvious why I would assert something like that. But one of the things I would point out is that is a self-assertion, Certainly the state of Indiana, which is where I reside at the moment, doesn't think that I am Brad Pitt, nor would they put on a driver's license that I am Brad Pitt. In other words, they do not assert, they do not give me a credential that says I'm Brad Pitt. All I say as a self-assertion is that I am Brad Pitt. So what we're going to talk about today is what higher education asserts on behalf of their students. And that is an assertion by, as a credential, by an authorized third party who has some experience, who has some authority to do so. So we're going to talk about credentials. So what is a credential? You guys all know it. The most common credential is the degree. And I've just said it in my little precursor here. What is it? It is something that a trusted third party who has trust or is considered an authority can say about a skill, competency, or an achievement that I have achieved, that they have basically confirmed and are willing to assert on behalf of their learner. We're all used to this, right? We typically put it out in terms of a diploma, right? And we do things to it to make sure that people will trust it. We put ribbons, we emboss it, we put a seal, we have signatures. We do all kinds of things to say, this is authentic. And Mark McConaughey, if Mark McConaughey was the recipient of this particular credential, we trust it. Anyway, that is a degree. So how do we send out, how do we issue those credentials? Well, usually, like in the case of a transcript here, we do it as an artifact, a piece of paper that doing all those things that I said, putting an emboss, putting a seal, putting signatures on it, ensuring that only this one is the one that we trust. And we put it out as an artifact, a piece of paper. We usually give it to the student and they put it on their wall or bulletin board, or maybe they share it with somebody who needs to see it. That's certainly more true in the international world than it is in the domestic one. You know, we also issue them more commonly now as digital artifacts. And what do I mean by digital artifact? Well, it's a PDF. A PDF is really nothing more than a digital image of a piece of paper, an artifact. It's whole. It's just that it is enveloped in a digital envelope and can be transmitted along the services that we have available to us now. And it enables us to transport it much more quickly than we could otherwise. We'll talk about its level of trust in a minute, but basically we treat it a lot the same way. We kind of give it either to the student. If it's a diploma like I've got displayed here, we give it to the student. The student may take it on PDF and give it directly to a potential employer, or maybe they'll put it on LinkedIn. In any case, it's a digital artifact. And last but not least, most of us in North America and in the United States share this information with the National Student Clearinghouse. We don't send them a diploma. We don't even send them a digital artifact. We send them a digital record. We do it in various ways. The most common way is with a text file, you know, a standard format that we exchange with the clearinghouse. And in fact, they serve as our proxy for certifying the fact that some individual received a degree from our institutions. That's a digital record. So we'll talk about those. We're really going to head toward a digital record, but certainly digital artifacts come up. And so, you know, I know you're much more interested in transcripts than you are diplomas, but think about what a transcript is. It's another form of credential. It carries with it a digital representation, maybe not a digital, but a representation of the degree that's been conferred upon the student, and it carries with it metadata, the requirements, the courses that the student had to complete in order to receive the achievement that we've bestowed upon them. So that's what the transcript is, another form of a credential. By the way, and I'll rant on this just a little bit, this credential, the transcript, has been in place since the late 1800s, since shortly after the definition of the credit hour. It is a chronological ledger. We put it that way because when we were collecting information about students back in the 1800s, the best we could do was at the end of the term is collapse everything into a single term. And we wrote it all down. And I tell you, it's 2023 and our transcript looks exactly the same. Chronological ledger with some summary statistics and the achievements attached. However, the concept I'd like you to start thinking about is that the transcript is nothing more than the metadata, the supporting information that is part of the diploma. So, trust in higher education. How, and one thing I will say, and I've been in higher education forever, one thing I will say is that despite what you say about what, some of the common criticisms of the degree are, one thing that I think is really true is that the business world, everyone has a high level of trust in what we assert on behalf of our students. If you got a degree, basically they believe the degree. And if usually when it comes up, it's because someone has self-asserted, like Brad Pitt like I say I'm Brad Pitt, they've self-asserted that they've had a degree on a resume, and they, at that point, no one bothered to verify that this person had a degree. If they go back to the source or go back to the clearinghouse, generally speaking, we trust it. Not only that, basically, we trust that there's a certain amount of veracity underpinning the degree that's been bestowed. And by that, I mean, right here, how do we do that? How do we maintain trust and integrity in what we assert as a degree? And the first is policy, governance, and framework, right? We spend a lot of time developing curriculum. The curriculum has a whole set of learning outcomes, both at the program level and in each of the individual course. They get reviewed. They get reviewed by not only the disciplinary faculty that live there, but also by the faculty that live outside that community. They give an opportunity to do that. Not only that, although not a principal part of this particular concern, basically we get vetted by an outside third party, accreditation. All of this, and that's to assure that we have these kinds of policies, practices in place to ensure that the degree that we assert is valid, has integrity, and has meaning. You know, the other part of that, that's all fine and good, but it's only as good as what we collect. So here's where registrars play a key role. It's all about maintaining good academic record processing practices and standards. We've got to collect it. We've got to understand who has the ability to put things in. In other words, we have to pay attention to access management. We have to have validation procedures so we have confidence in the data that lives on the record. We have certain kinds of practices and policies that govern the system of record in general. So these are the pieces that we put together in order to have a valid credential, a trusted credential in the outside world. So those are two legs. So think of this as a big stool, and there are two legs that it's standing on. What's the third piece? Well, the third piece is transmission. So in the typical pathway today, a student will ask the registrar, who happens to be the officer at most institutions who issues these kinds of credentials. Not that they have the authority behind them, they're the issuer of these kinds of credentials. So what happens in the old days, back in the 1800s, all the way through the 1900s, we would get the request, we would put that kind of transcript into a signed and sealed envelope, trust the US mail, and basically the reviewer would open that up, and as long as the seal was unbroken, we trusted, excuse me, wow, the sun came out. We trusted that what was contained within the envelope emanated from the issuer and was unchanged. It was tamper evident, right? Because if the seal was broken, we assumed that something happened to that transcript. So that's been tried and true. That was true when I started in the profession in the 1970s. Still true today. We still send out paper transcripts. But that's really how it worked. Now, basically, when it's starting in the 80s at some time, when PDFs became the coin of the realm in terms of transmitting transcripts, basically we did the same thing. We just leaned on not signed and sealed envelopes. We leaned on digital signatures and PKI encryption. And I won't go deeply into it, but in essence, you put a transcript into a PDF. You basically encrypt it so that you have a calculated value. If it gets opened on the network, that calculated value is stored home somewhere, and it calculates again. And if they match, it's valid. If it doesn't match, it's been tampered with. And it almost doesn't matter. I mean, the slightest little thing will change that algorithm and cause it to have a different value. We call that phone home. The official version is PKI. Don't ask me what it's public keys infrastructure, public key infrastructure. That's what that is. We've relied on this a lot. And in fact, it really performs the same task. So with all those three legs on the stool, we have very good trust in credentials that are issued by higher education. So we're here talking about alternative credentials, digital credentials, badges, comprehensive learner record, learner and employment record. All of these, and I'll say it again at the end of the thing, all of these are credentials. By the way, mostly when I talk about something like a badge, and I'll say this again at the appropriate time, but there's a couple different levels of badges and recognition and so forth. There are badges that are only recognition badges. They're issued for good reasons. They may be for persistence, for engagement, but they're not meant to serve as a true credential. A true credential is an achievement. It's something that's been governed. It's something we understand. It's something we want to assert on behalf of the student that has true integrity and meaning. Both have their place, but mostly what I'm talking about is the latter. So, first and foremost, these badges, these credentials, these learner and employment records, they're an official institutional record containing all of those things that I talked about on the previous slide: governance, validity practices, all of those things. They are an official assertion of the institution. And secondly, yes, we have all of our credentials at this point have really been focused on curricular achievements. And that's still true. We can assert alternative credentials that emanate from the curricular domain. So it's learning that happens throughout the student's educational career. And that certainly includes the curricular context. So first and foremost, it can emanate from there. Secondly, it can come from a co-curricular context or from an internship or some other experiential process, provided, at least as AACRAO sees it and as we see it, that it has the appropriate governance surrounding it, right? It's the same thing. As long as you trust the learning that's occurred, as long as there's been assessment, as long as people who are experts have decided that, yes, this in fact has value, it's a learning experience, and we can assert it on behalf of the student, then by all means, we should be taking that into account, but it's structured in much the same way the curricular domain is. And last but not least, and this is really an extension of what we already do, if we have educational partners. We do this all the time. We have consortia where we're willing to offer either credit or assertions of value based upon a partnership we've developed with either another institution, or perhaps we have entered into a relationship to support an internship. We do these kinds of things. There's absolutely no reason, as long as we trust our partnership, as long as we have the appropriate practices, procedures, governance in place, that we wouldn't be able to assert this on behalf of the student too. And then last but not least, and I think this probably hits home with this group more than others, is that there's absolutely no reason why any of these records, including the current transcript, can't carry the metadata that supports what it's asserting. So what I mean by that is, why can't we carry more information about the particular components on a particular record? So if we have a course on a record, why don't we carry its learning outcomes with it too? Certainly we have the means to do it. We have the technological platforms that'll support something like this. We have the data standards to support something like this, yet we don't do it. So, a course, the course description. You can even go beyond that, particularly in the world of labor market. If you wanted to carry learning artifacts, I wrote a paper for this. It got assessed. Here's the assessed value. It's been asserted as being valid. Why can't we attach this to something, meaning to something like a course that basically stands as proof, as evidence that this kind of learning occurred? All of these things are possible. And in fact, there are ways we can make that happen. We just haven't adopted them, particularly at scale. So all of these things happen. So not is it's an official institutional record, and it's an assertion. It can happen, it basically can happen through the curricular, co-curricular, or partnership kinds of entities. And last but not least, and perhaps most importantly for this group, it can carry loads of information. So those are the three primary tenets. So what's a learning record? Well, we already know the true traditional ones, the academic ones that we're accustomed to, which is the diploma and the transcript already there. The other thing to think about, though, is the third one there, which is second from the right, I think, as you're seeing it, at least as that's how I'm seeing it. That's a badge, right? And a badge, nothing more than a digital expression of learning, assuming it's gone through all the things that I've already described. There it is. It just represents something like critical thinking. But you know what a badge could also represent is a degree. It could also represent that I took a course. And if I open it up, here are the learning outcomes, here's the course description, and so forth. If you go to the furthest right, that little icon is really meant to be a comprehensive learner record or a learner and employment record. And in essence, this thing on the right can contain everything to its left. A badge only represents one thing. A comprehensive learner record basically can contain all of them. So what I'm saying is I can take that transcript and I can represent it as a comprehensive learner record. And really the only distinction is, man, now I have the capability via the standards to add all this metadata to it. Not only could I do that, I could have the transcript. And if I have important learning that occurred in other domains within the institution, I can include that there. And I understand how they roll up to one another, the associations they have with each other. So the best example to think of is courses roll up and support the requirements of a degree. You can express that relationship in a CLR. Similarly, you may get a badge, and the badge may require that you take a course, but you also have this other experience that's been supervised. And in order to get the badge, you have to do both of those things. And that can be represented very well in a comprehensive learner record. So these are all learning records. These are all credentials. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about self-sovereignty. I'll go through this relatively quickly. I bet most of you are already familiar with the idea. But here you go. You see across the main row is the set of credentials I've already been talking about, the set of learning records I've been talking about. The traditional model is the student asks the registrar to distribute these, and they distribute them to the third party, whether that be another higher education, institution of higher education, or whether it be somebody in the labor market for an opportunity they're pursuing as a career. So that's typical. You're all aware of that. So what's self-sovereignty? Self-sovereignty is really, I now no longer have to directly issue them to the third party because I have levels of trust in what I've embedded in the digital credentials themselves. I can issue them directly to the student, let the student basically disclose them to whomever they wish without violation of trust. And that's the key thing here. So even though I've issued a transcript to the student, they can go ahead and issue or send it off to one of you for transfer reasons. And as long as the digital encryption is sound, then you can trust it, even though it went through the student's hands. And that's the basic concept. What else I have on here, though, is a digital wallet. If we're expressing these according to data standards and within and doing the appropriate things for digital signatures and PKI encryption, we can also send it to a digital wallet. These standards also enable the student to be able to basically say, well, I've got something from Indiana. I've also got something from the University of Phoenix. I ought to be able to stack those together and put it as my dossier and send it off to whoever needs it. So that's the kind of thing that you can do in a digital wallet. So last but not least is the concept of a learner and employment record. And that's this over here. Can you guys see my cursor? So it's this lower left over here. And so what you have there is higher education is not the only issuer of credentials. People get other types of credentials all the time. And what do I mean by that? Well, they get a credential from Microsoft that they can manage LAN. They get a credential from Google that they know JSON. They get you get the idea. I don't need to go through them. But those are perfectly valid credentials in and of themselves as well. You depend upon the issuer, you depend upon the fact that if they've issued them appropriately, not only can the student then say, hey, I've got my degree here from Indiana, I've got an internship from Eli Lilly, and I've got something from Google. I can stack them all together and see what happens with my opportunity over here with employer X, Y, or Z. So that's the whole idea. And all of this can be embedded with trust. In other words, if you're conforming to all of the standards that are appropriate to the expression of this digital credential, then even as it goes through and is curated by the student, by the time the reviewer sees it, they still have that level of trust. So where are we? So that was sort of all of the introduction. And basically, I've said that a credential is a credential is a credential, whether it's expressed as a diploma or as a badge or as a CLR or as an LER. Well, does it have any traction here in the world of higher education? And the answer is that it really does. When we started this in 2015, as I already talked about, there's hardly anyone doing. There were a few outliers, and there were a few, those who were pushing the ends of this. But as a mainstream thing, no, it didn't catch on. So as part of some work we were doing that AACRAO was doing for Walmart, we did a survey over the course of the summer in July. And basically the main idea was, well, there were lots of main ideas, but one of the things we really wanted to have a baseline for was, what kind of scale do we have? What kind of traction do these alternative credentials have? And there you see it, interestingly enough, about 40% of everyone who responded to the survey. I don't know that means that we have 40% of all institutions issuing digital credentials, but 40% of everyone who responded were already in the process of either developing or already issuing digital credentials. Well, that's quite a jump. I mean, that really is some growth that's happened. And I think most of that growth has happened since COVID, now, honestly. It really took off at that point in time, the rise of online education and so on and so forth. I don't have proof of that, by the way. That's an hypothesis on my part. Nevertheless, it's pretty remarkable. Another 20% of the folks are really considering it at the moment. So if it's not, it's on their doorstep, it's in their plans, they're considering it and moving forward. So if we get that far, we're already over half of the institutions who have some form of credential. Now, what you're saying to yourself, does that mean all academic credentials are going to come in this manner? Absolutely not. That's not there. And one of the things I usually say, which I didn't this time, but I'll say it now, is that, the whole idea of digital credentials, a comprehensive learner record, learner employment record, we're not out to undermine the transcript per se. We're not. The transcript's going to have a life for many, many years ahead. We think we can improve upon that, but nevertheless, it's going to have a life. However, even if all the terminology changes, even if a CLR or a badge or all of those things kind of die out, this whole concept of digital identity, a digital credential per se, the ability to do these kinds of things in a digital world with trust and validity is going to happen. Terminology may change, but I firmly believe this is the future. The other little note on there, which I'll only say, well, I'll just say it because it was a funny result coming out of the survey, is that even though AACRAO was sort of the architect behind the term a comprehensive learner record, or a CLR, the cognition or the recognition of a CLR was very low compared to badges, micro-credentials, and alternative credentials, which was a little surprising to us because we've been preaching CLRs forever. LERs are really starting to take over because they have a broader, they have broader influence. More people are interested in that. It's not just a higher education thing. To be relevant, we're going to have to stay in that context. What ultimately will it be called? I don't know. But just because CLRs were tended to be weaker, it doesn't change the nature of what was going on with the results of adoption of digital micro-credentials. So now I threw this, this is now sort of the end of the intro. And I threw these couple slides in from another presentation that I did because I thought it was relevant to all of you. I think I've already pitched that one of the reasons I think that these alternative credentials are so relevant to you, whether they come in the form of a badge or a CLR, is that the power is in the kind of information they can bring forward. It's not just a course and a title and a grade and the number of hours. They can bring a lot of information that currently, if you don't have it in your articulation table, you've got to go look up somehow. Maybe you have it, maybe you have a shared database with somebody, maybe you have a vendor who does it for you. But if you don't, then you've got to go to the website, find the course description, find the learning outcomes, then send it off to the faculty or the appropriate department and figure out where in your curricular context does this particular course fit. So I think I'm speaking the same language, and correct me if I've done something wrong. But so I did this a couple years ago. Well, probably about a year and a half ago. I got these numbers from the National Student Clearinghouse. So look, a transcript, about 82% of the transcripts that we issue at the moment, 82% of them are either paper or PDF, right? And if we issue them either to the student or to the third party or to another institution, even if it comes as paper, or often, not for everybody, but often, if it comes to an institution, even as a PDF, we have to print it off, treat it as a source document, and go from there. That's what the data entry piece is in the lower right. Now, you're all going to say, oh, yeah, but we have Speedy. Well, that's true. We do have Speedy. And I just did a presentation with a representative of National Student Clearinghouse, Groot, and here are some of the latest numbers on that. About 18% of all exchange of information is done via XML. And you guys are probably aware of this. These are most likely in specific states where there was a state mandate in order to adopt Speedy, in order to perform it. Phoenix, University of Phoenix is one of those where, and I will also say Speedy has dialects. They have dialects either associated with their state, dialects in forms of what form they take, whether it's EDI, XML, and soon to be JSON. And one of the difficulties is that if it's EDI, you have to talk to somebody who's doing EDI. If you're XML, you got to talk to somebody who's doing XML. The reason I mentioned the University of Phoenix is University of Phoenix has invested in an ability to basically take them both, right? They built it so that they can take either form and basically ingest it into their system. But as you can see, the last thing I'll say is we've had Speedy since 1989. So well over 30 years, still with only an 18% adoption rate. So what we have to consider, what are the reasons for that? Why can't we exchange digitally and ingest digitally the kinds of information that we've had with a standard for the last 30 years? Well, I don't know. Well, I do have some feel for that, but here's kind of where we're headed. And don't get hung up on whether it's XML or anything, but what we really want to do is take the CLR, which I remind you, basically can include a transcript, can include something like an achievement, like a degree, or a credential like a degree, as well as these other things. So don't get hung up on the fact that it might be co-curricular, but once we get it this far, we ought to be able to send everything in this manner. right? We ought to be able to take it right to here with all of the metadata associated with it and ingest it. So we recognize that this is an issue. And one of the things that AACRAO is working on is to find ways in which we can simplify this process. So this big circle in the middle, that is all about a shared service or a big conversion engine. It's more than a conversion engine, but what ought to happen over here is no matter what form I can transmit the information, I ought to be able to go to some service and transform it into something that somebody needs and can ingest. If it's a PDF, I ought to be able to transform that into some structured data and send it where it needs to go. Likewise, if you're the institution on this end, we ought to be able to send it in a manner that you can ingest it so that you don't have to print it out and do the data entry yourself. So that's what we're looking at. I don't really have enough time to go through into all these pieces. It's more complicated than just one structured data language to another structured data language. But the whole idea is that there is this shared commons, this shared suite of services that enable this digital interoperability. Digital, and there's also semantic interoperability, which you guys know better than I do. But the whole idea behind this, the cell phone industry was able to do this, right? You can have a Samsung phone, you can have an Apple phone, you can have a Google phone. Somehow they all talk to each other, yet they've still been able to competitively differentiate on the outside. So how do they do that? We ought to be able to do the exact same thing. Think of the financial industry. You can use an ATM from anywhere in the world and you can get your money. How does that work? It's not that they all started with the same standard. They figured it out. We're going to have to figure that out too. So that's really the goal behind this. And last but not least, this is the idea that, and this has some other components to it, but there's certainly been some work on using AI to take PDFs and convert that to structured language, and even enabling those who have their own, recognizing that those would be self-assertions, those would be Brad Pitt-like from me, and not really a trusted credential that is asserted from the institution. You can't see my pointing and where I'm pointing, but you understand what I'm trying to say. I think I'll skip this slide, although this does show our current conundrum, which is, man, there are lots of terms, lots of things going on. And I think that's all I want to say about it. And I've said a lot of them: CLR, LER, digital badge, micro-credential, alternative credential. If you don't get anything else out of this, a credential is a credential. Whether that be a diploma, whether that be a badge asserting that I can critically think, as long as all of the underpinnings of that credential have been met and you haven't violated trust and integrity. And if all of those things are true, then you can accept them as being credentials as well. So that's all this slide is saying, is that a credential is a credential, and they're just different points along a continuum and contains some different information, but it has that understanding, the foundation, that we put all of those pieces in place in order to trust them. Last but not least, and I don't need to go into this because I see what time it is. We're at about 4:15, and this is just to say that AACRAO recognizes not only learner mobility, but learning mobility. We didn't really talk about it, but skills and competencies can also be compared and mapped to one another. It takes a lot of work, but those things can and will, I think, at some point happen. And with the advent of AI, these things are going to move relatively quickly, I think. Again, quality assurance is always going to be an issue in this regard, but nevertheless, the whole idea behind this is that not only should students be able, or learners be able to move from institution to institution, the learning that they've achieved ought to be able to move not only from institution to institution, but institution over to the labor market, maybe even internationally as well. So that's what this slide is trying to say. And all of us in AACRAO, are integral components of that. And here are some of the things we're working on, but I don't want to spend time on that. I've spoken a lot, you guys didn't interrupt. Even though I had some great jokes in there, I didn't hear any laughter. And maybe they weren't great jokes, but you're not going to tell me that, because I've self-asserted that they are good jokes.
Well, that's the pro and con of self-assertion.
That's
but
right.
from that perspective, I do think that there were some people laughing. I even got a note from someone else. So always good to hear that. We'll start. There wasn't any questions that popped up in the chat in real time, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask Mark those questions right now as we have you. As I wait for the chat to see if any questions come in, just a couple of things that Mark said that I want to kind of emphasize as in his presentation. One is, if your institution isn't talking about this just yet, they will be, because of the interoperable needs, and also where industry is coming in to drive some of the innovation in credentials and getting a more fulsome picture of our students and learning, and then everything else they're bringing to the table as an employee. So as students go through this process, and as more regulators also, that's a party that we didn't talk about, tries to put pressures on value of education, or the conversation around that, these type of credentials and kind of a credential wallet or a passport that compiles everything will become more and more important. And I think technology wise, also as people who work at institutions, especially in the transfer areas, we know that technology is pretty slow to change at tech worlds. And so your voices actually can help with that, making sure that your SIS or other vendors kind of are open to these changes, and also looking at things on an interoperable basis instead of just an insular basis, because ultimately we'll all have to merge somewhere along the line in regards to these data exchanges. So anyway, those are a couple of takeaways, I think, from Mark's presentation that were salient. However, any questions still? I don't see anything in the chat, so if there is a brave soul that wants to come off of mute and ask one, we can go that route too.
Don't be intimidated. I can't reach out and grab you. The other thing I would say is, I want to echo what Mark just said. You guys really can help. There is whenever we speak with the big SISs, they always say there's simply no demand for this. And it's almost a tautological loop, right? There's no demand, they don't do it. Since they don't do it, there's no demand, right? And until the value that you can see emanating from this kind of infrastructure and this kind of assertion of credentials, until they get that from some of their customers, they're not going to directly support it. By the way, and I'll say this, and I don't want to upset anybody who might be a vendor, although I don't think there are any vendors here, but there is a certain amount of, how do I want to say it? If you're locked into a certain vendor and they've handled certain kinds of things for you, that will work as long as you're tied into that vendor. But you're locked in. If you want to be able to reach outside that umbrella, or you end up having to terminate your relationship with that vendor, things will change remarkably. If, on the other hand, they've adopted, the core, then you can easily move in and out and let what they do on the feature function fulfillment side differentiate what you purchase.
So thanks for that, Mark, and I think that's really good information. There is a couple of questions, so I'll read them off for you that actually just came in. So Patty asks, how would you recommend connecting the various systems that are instituted before a CLR is established? An example would be different departments that are rolling out badging on their own when our transcript system would have been able to do the same.
Yeah, so what you've got is some independence going on there. My first advice is, one, acknowledge it. Second advice is start to get involved, but basically say, hey, look, if you're issuing these types of credentials, we want to do it for the long haul. We want to treat it the same way we do a degree or any other credential that emanates from the institution. Why don't you let me help you bring my record professionalism to bear on this so that we keep it as close as we can to the other things that we keep. And so, in essence, let's make it part of the institution. Let's not make you run this out on your own. And the problem with that is that if they're running it out on their own, there's no institutional persistence, none beyond whoever's initiative it was. So that's the first thing that hits me. And that means you'll have to get others involved. You'll have to get IT involved. You'll have to figure out what you need to do. One of the things, I didn't do it in this particular one, but if you are issuing true credentials, and if somebody's doing it via a vendor like Credly or any of the others, what are you doing about keeping the permanence of the system of record? That's something you need to think about. So 30 years from now, or 20 years from now, when this person needs this credential, assuming it's a real credential, by the way, not a recognition, just a real credential, how are you going to do that? How do you stand behind and still serve the learner? So that's my off the head response to that one.
Very good. Thanks for that, Mark. Rebecca actually adds in a question. Are there currently any best practices for interpreting micro-credentials from various sources? I'll let you start with that one, Mark. I'll provide some other things that I've seen as someone who issues micro-credentials. So, Mark, go ahead.
Well, the first thing I say is that actually I'll say as a broad-based approach, there is no overwhelming standard or practice for recognizing what is a quality assertion and what isn't. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but there just isn't at the moment. And the other thing I would say is, in a structured way, there isn't for our other credentials as well. No, we don't have a stamp of approval from some third authority surrounding our issuance of a transcript, right? We depend upon someone looking in and knowing that we're accredited. That's the pathway, but there's no easy way to discern that from just opening a transcript, right? And so the same problem exists with these forms of digital credentials. There's lots of talk about this, by the way. And by the way, if it comes from Stanford or Harvard, or probably any one of your institutions, you probably don't doubt it, as long as you've got those pieces in place. You understand what the digital signature is there, that it's not been tampered with, that you trust the encryption and the means by which it was transmitted to you. And therefore you're going on reputation, more or less. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but that's the way it happens. There is discussion in the space about how to improve that lot, because what we're doing now is asserting some things that don't rise to the level of scrutiny associated with accreditation. So how do you ensure that something that comes from Indiana University, say critical thinking, has in fact been through the appropriate vetting? And we're working on those kinds of things. Or if you get from McConaughey U, how do you know McConaughey U is valid?
Yeah, and I think, Rebecca, and that's great advice from Mark. A couple of things also. When it comes to micro-credentials, because there isn't a standard behind them, one of the things you want to do is ask for the data behind the micro-credential. And the more salient and relevant badging sources right now will give you what stands behind the badge as far as assessments or work that the students did. Ultimately, most institutions are going to have to lean on their internal CPL practices to make content equivalencies on the learning that exists. I would not do hours only. So I know there's some people that fall in the pit of, I'm going to evaluate, and if it's, 45 hours, which is the Carnegie unit for a credit hour, I'm just going to do that on hours alone. It's actually the learning obtained, and so you're going to have that's kind of a CPL disclaimer. Look at the learning rather than just the straight hours, because they could have just been introduced to content but not assessed on any content. So but you're going to oftentimes have to find out what's behind the micro credential and who is doing it. There's a difference between an admissions badge. I've seen schools give out badges, you're admitted, versus an emergency preparedness
Recognition badge, Mark.
Yeah. So those are the things you have to parse through, and it is an area that is kind of the wild west. But if you're going to evaluate, try to get as much data behind the credential, and then lean into whatever your accreditor or agencies say for evaluations on those, because there isn't a standard, unfortunately, at this point. Now, when we get to the CLRs and the LERs, as Mark talked about, you should be able to get more data behind that, and also maybe some reciprocity on credit hours or some things like that, but we're just not there yet. So great question though, Rebecca, appreciate that. Prudence has a question on how are institutions handling unused transfer credits. She put the second part to it of often not all credits are automatically accepted by a receiving school through the grades that are acceptable and passing grades. One of the things I'm going to say on this one, actually, Prudence, is I'd want people on this call in the committee to share how they do that. Each school is going to be different. And that's the one thing. Unused transfer credits on an institution basis, there's several different ways to do it. And that may be one that, if I'll also source it around, if you could put your email in the chat, to a lot of different entities that are on the committee, because that's not a one answer fit all. That is a unused transfer credits at a school that aren't acceptable or applied. How do they go? That will differ school to school to school. So that is on that one. But I think Hala had one, Mark, that I can give to you. Do you think that a stackable micro-credential would go on a transcript of records similar to academic courses?
Yeah, I do. And my, for those of you who use something like PeopleSoft, there's a concept called a milestone, and a milestone may represent any kind of experiential activity or accomplishment of the student, or completion of the student, that doesn't easily fit into a course metric. And a badge is exactly the same kind of thing. So we may not call it a badge, but something like a milestone, and I don't know if Ellucian has the same concept, a notation on a transcript may also be the exact same thing. So it's just a representation of an accomplishment that the institution wishes to acknowledge. Does that answer your question, Prudence?
Oh, that one's from Paula. Prudence had
yeah, actually you did. Thank you.
All right, and then actually Prudence had a second part to all state accredited university accept credits from state accredited universities only. Not exactly. I mean, no. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends on the school. That's another great one. Prudence, I think you have a lot of great questions that the committee and I can assist with on general transfer. The 30-second answer is states sometimes can mandate reciprocity within the state, and then sometimes, even when that happens, the state institution will make their own policies. Each institution can make their own transfer credit policies, which makes the world of transfer credit kind of wild and exciting sometimes, because even when a regulator says something, there's a way around it sometimes. We'll see at schools. So it's a great question on that end. Typically there's reciprocity state within state, but not all the time. You'll find courses not accepted for similar content area requirements for whatever reason, from school to school.
So the age-old question, is it a commodity or a work of art?
That's right. Quantitative and qualitative. Well, hey everybody, it's 1 o'clock. This call was recorded, so you've been a great audience. We appreciate you. Let's give a hand to Mark McConaughey for all of his time today. Virtual hand of applause, and appreciate him and his time and his work on this area. He also works with AACRAO. You can reach out to him if you have any other questions. Our next call, identifying what time we will do that. It's actually the 4th week in December. We may move it a couple of weeks out just to make sure we can reach our audience, and we'll be sharing the topic out with the AACRAO community. But appreciate all of you, and have a great rest of the month, and happy fall holidays. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.